So I'm Patricia Hernandez, and the topic for my project is residential segregation and proximity to quality facilities in Florida. The question I wanted to answer is there a relationship between higher levels of segregation and minority proximity to quality facilities at the census tract level in Florida? So today, minorities continue to exhibit characteristics that are generally associated with lower socioeconomic status. They usually have lower levels of education, lower incomes, and they also tend to be found clustered in lower income neighborhoods, which has a negative impact on their accessibility to quality hospitals, quality schools, as well as recreational facilities. And this can signify an important loss in social capital that can handicap groups of people for generations. So my hypothesis is that high levels of segregation will be evident in Florida, and blacks and Hispanics will live closer to least desirable facilities, while whites will live closer to more desirable facilities. My study was conducted looking at 4 different types of facilities. Correctional and pollution facilities were used as evidence of undesirable residential areas. Proximity to quality hospitals was used as evidence of desirable residential areas. And schools were either desirable or undesirable based on their type and use. Why Florida? For 2 main reasons. First, there's the Florida Geographic Data Library, where I got my information from. And this library is well stocked in terms of information on cultural and demographic data, as well as infrastructure and public facilities. All the data is georeferenced, and it comes in the same coordinate system. The shapefiles come with very complete metadata. Secondly, and more importantly, the population of Florida is one of the most diverse in the United States. According to the 2010 census, it has a population of over 18 million people, and is the 4th most heavily populated state in the nation. It is the home of a significant number of immigrants, the biggest group being Hispanics. And the 3 biggest demographic groups are whites. Whites make up 57.8% of the population. Hispanics make up 22.4%, and blacks make up 15.9%. So I used the hotspot analysis tool to find out where these demographic groups were clustered. And as you can see, blacks seem to be clustered around the major cities, Tallahassee, Jacksonville, Orlando, and around southern Florida and Miami. Hispanics are in the southern portion of the state and tracts around Orlando. Whites are more spread out. They seem to be outside of the major cities except for Jacksonville. And this map shows all 3 demographic groups overlaid. As you can see, Hispanics and blacks are the hotspot is around Fort Lauderdale and Miami. Around Orlando, you see hotspots for all 3 groups. In Jacksonville, you see a hotspot for both blacks and whites. These are the tracts that displayed the highest degree of segregation. And the way I arrived at a segregation index for the tracts was I used the Global Spatial Dissimilarity tool, which is a third-party tool that is compatible with ArcMap 10.1. And what this tool does is it measures how different local population patterns are from the global population pattern. So in this case, the local population patterns would be the individual census tracts, and the global population pattern would be the proportions for the entire state. So I selected the tracts that had a segregation index of 0.8 or higher, which indicates a very high degree of segregation. The tool puts out an index between 0 and 1, 0 being perfect integration, and 1 being perfect segregation. So 0.8 is pretty high. And as you can see, high segregation tracts are located around the bigger cities, Jacksonville, Orlando, Tampa, which is not a hotspot for either one of the demographic groups, Fort Lauderdale and Miami. I also used the hotspot analysis tool to find out where the segregation hotspots were located. And I was pretty surprised to find out that Fort Lauderdale and Miami is actually a segregation cold spot, which means that despite the fact that you see segregations with high segregation index, tracts with high segregation index, you actually, according to the hotspot tool, you actually find more low segregation tracts surrounded by low segregation tracts. Hotspots for segregation were generally found along the white white concentration areas. At a 90% confidence level, you find segregation hotspots around Orlando, Jacksonville, and Tallahassee, which is below the accepted threshold of 0.05, but I did see a lot of high segregation tracts around those areas, so I included it anyway. And the global spatial dissimilarity index for the entire state is 0.534, indicating a moderate degree of segregation. The first type of facility that I studied were correctional facilities, and I selected the maximum and closed custody facilities because those are where the worst criminals are sent, so I thought those were even more undesirable. And as you can see, well, I ran a 3-mile and 5-mile buffer. As you can see, blacks and Hispanics are overrepresented, and I'm sorry, blacks and whites are overrepresented and Hispanics are underrepresented at both the 3 and the 5-mile buffer area. So you can see the difference on the graph, but I wanted to find out whether these differences were statistically significant, so I did chi-square because we're all familiar with it. And the chi-square goodness of fit test is employed to measure how closely the observed population distribution match the expected. So in this case, the expected population distribution is the proportions for the entire state, because perfect integration within the study area and evenness in population distribution implies that the racial makeup within the buffer zones will reflect the proportions for the entire state. That is, given that in Florida, whites make up 57.8%, Hispanics 22.4%, and blacks 15.9%. If we assume that no one demographic group is being overrepresented or underrepresented, then we would assume that we would see similar proportions within the buffer areas. So my expected would be the proportions for the entire state. As you can see, the chi-square is pretty high, which tells me that there is a statistically significant discrepancy with blacks and whites being overrepresented and Hispanics being underrepresented. And that's not surprising, because if you look at the map, you'll see, well, the maximum security facilities were located on the northern part of the state, which is not a hotspot for Hispanics. I also did a 3- and 5-mile buffer around both maximum and closed custody. Hispanics in this case are overrepresented, while blacks and whites are underrepresented. And those discrepancies were actually not significant. I looked at pollution facilities, and I looked at high polluters, those that emitted 500,000 pounds or more of pollution, and then all pollution facilities. If you see, the high polluters are mostly located in the northern areas. And then when you look at all the polluters, you'll see that there's a cluster around Fort Lauderdale and Miami. And for the high polluters, whites and blacks were overrepresented, Hispanics were underrepresented, both 3- and 5-mile. But the discrepancies were not significant. When I included all polluters, blacks and Hispanics went up. That's not surprising, because you did see the cluster of pollution facilities around southern Florida. And those discrepancies were also not significant. I studied pollution in terms of amount of pollution and number of people. So I did the ordinary least square regression, which is one of the most common linear regressions. And I used my independent variable was amount of pollutions, and my dependent variable were all 3 demographic groups. The p-value is 0.217, which is a lot higher than the 0.05 threshold, which means that there is no linear relationship. I also looked at hospitals, and there are actually 260 hospitals in Florida, so I selected the ones that I thought were better. And this selection was done based on the U.S. News Regional Hospital Rankings, and there have to be 2 or more such hospitals, and at least one of them has to be nationally ranked in at least 1 specialty or high performing in at least 4 specialties. There were 10 nationally ranked hospitals in Florida. I did a 1-mile buffer and 3-mile buffer rather than 3 and 5, because people tend to live closer to hospitals and schools as opposed to correctional facilities. As you can see, blacks and Hispanics are overrepresented around better hospitals, and those discrepancies were not significant. I also studied schools. I looked at 4 different types of schools: most desirable, least desirable, Title I Part A, and targeted assistance. Most desirable schools, I selected those based on the Florida Department of Education school rankings, and those are the schools that got a letter grade of A based on standardized test scores, graduation rates, and participation in accelerated programs, and other factors. Least desirable schools are the ones that I selected based on their program. If it was alternative to expulsion, Department of Juvenile Justice, halfway house, and jail, or by their use, alternative education. Title I Part A schools are schools that receive Title I funding so that they can implement programs, school-wide programs that are aimed at helping students that have been identified as most at risk for failing standardized tests. And it's supposed to help them get over that threshold. And one of the ways in which a Title I Part A school qualifies for that funding is if 40% or more of their student body comes from low-income families. And then targeted assistance are schools that receive Title A Part A funding, but not for school-wide programs, rather for programs for students, selected students that have been identified as being at risk for failure. 1 mile buffer around most desirable schools shows us that blacks and Hispanics are overrepresented, whites are underrepresented. Trend continues at the 3 mile buffer. And these results are actually statistically significant, which means that the discrepancy is significant, with Hispanics and blacks actually living, more Hispanics and blacks living closer to more desirable schools than whites. A 1 mile buffer around least desirable schools, blacks and Hispanics again overrepresented. But the discrepancy was not significant. For Title A Part A schools, I only ran a 1 mile buffer because that captured over 75% of my population. And I think that's pretty significant. These are the schools that get funding if 40% or more of their student body is living below the poverty line. And at 1 mile, I captured 75% of the population, which sort of gave me my first hint at maybe the socioeconomic status of Florida in general. And as you see, blacks and Hispanics are overrepresented, whites are underrepresented. The results were not significant. Targeted assistance, blacks and Hispanics were underrepresented, whites were overrepresented. This might be due, in my research, I came across this, this one article that talked about how lower income whites tend to be more able to live near middle and upper income whites than do minorities. So targeted assistance are schools that receive funding for identified kids that have been identified as being at risk for failure, but not all of them. So that tells me that these schools have a wider range of socioeconomic status. And whites are overrepresented, but the results are not statistically significant. So Florida was assigned a segregation index of 0.534. There were statistically significant differences in observed and expected population distributions in areas near maximum custody correctional facilities, as well as more desirable schools. These discrepancies were expressed in higher than expected black and white proportions near maximum custody correctional facilities, and higher than expected black and Hispanic proportions near more desirable schools. So the segregation index tool shows a moderate degree of segregation for the entire state of Florida. But this did not seem to affect minority proximity to quality facilities. Minorities seem to be doing at least as well as non-minorities, and Hispanics appear to be living in greater than expected proportions near more desirable facilities, and smaller than expected proportions near least desirable facilities. For future directions, I thought about looking at the census blocks as a unit of analysis, but most of the research that I was following did census tracts, but I feel that census blocks might exaggerate the results because they're smaller and tend to be more homogeneous. I think desegregating the Hispanic population might also exaggerate the results. I think Cubans are doing better than the rest of the Hispanic subgroups, and I think studying Cubans by themselves might exaggerate the differences, and also it might highlight differences within Hispanic subgroups. And exploring socioeconomic status, that idea came to me when I saw how many Title I Part A schools were in the entire state. There is a bunch. And so I went online and just did a quick search, like poverty Florida, and read some articles. One of them was like top 10 states that are poor, and Florida was like the 4th one. So I think that it seems as though minorities are at least doing as well as non-minorities. And it might be because the white section of the population is experiencing higher poverty levels than has been traditionally seen, making it seem that minorities are doing better than they actually are. And comparing Florida to other states to see if Florida is unusual or if we're seeing a difference in the status quo for minorities. Those are my works cited. Luke and Bill is up there. And thank you. Questions? No?
So you're making this comparison, I just wasn't clear, probably
Okay.
I'm tired at the end of the day here. Overrepresented and underrepresented.
Okay,
What does that exactly mean?
so if you look at this graph, my expected population is the proportions for the entire state. So if you assume that within the buffer areas, no one demographic group is, being discriminated against, like more minorities living near least desirable facilities, you would assume that the proportions within the buffer areas would reflect the proportions for the entire state. So in this case, my expected population distribution is the proportion seen within Florida, and my observed are the proportions that I saw within my buffer areas. So when I say like the whites are overrepresented, I'm saying that I saw more whites within my buffer areas than I should have seen, based on the proportions for the state.
By looking at the data and seeing the results.
Well, I looked at all my buffer areas and put all my proportions together and compared them for the entire state. Anything else? Awesome. Thank you.